Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Crash F1 podcast with me, Ian Mangan, and of course, joining me is Lucas Cochran and Lewis Larkham. Well, a chaotic Mexican Grand Prix saw Lando Norris take a dominant victory, which puts him back in the lead of the Drivers' Championship, separated by his championship rival, Oscar Piastri, by just 1 point, and Max Verstappen is still very much in the rearview mirrors of the two McLaren drivers. And a controversial penalty for Lewis Hamilton saw him miss out on potentially his first podium with Ferrari, and has everyone talking about the FIA and stewarding calls this weekend. Well, let's just jump into it, guys. Lucas, a Mexican Grand Prix that was probably more memorable than some of the more recent ones over the last few years.
Yeah, to have a Mexican Grand Prix out-excite a Singapore Grand Prix is quite a rare occasion on the calendar. And I think this was probably the most memorable Mexican Grand Prix in recent memory, if not ever, to be honest. We had fights up and down the grid. We had great upsets from Ollie Bearman, and yeah, people really out of place. And that's always a great recipe for a great race. Some phenomenal defending as well. And poor Oscar trying to fight his way back through the pack and doing a little bit of an early 2025 Lando Norris impression, which I'm sure we'll touch on a bit later. But really, really great stuff up and down the grid. Can't complain at all.
Yeah, it was an excellent weekend overall. I think qualifying was really exciting too, which was great to see. And there was a lot of unknowns heading into the weekend, I think, after the first couple of practice sessions. So it's really opening things up. Lewis, let's talk, of course, about Lando Norris and where he is now in the championship. He has finally reclaimed that position as leader of the driver's title. I think the last time he led the driver's title was heading into the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. So this is a huge boost for him, but still only 1 point between him and Oscar Piastri, but a dominant victory from Lando Norris. It really felt like he did everything he needed to do this weekend.
Yeah, you're right. It's first time he's led the championship since April, which is pretty crazy. But Piastri was in that lead for 15 races. But this was a massive weekend for Lando Norris and his title hopes. It was a statement victory, really. I think one that could potentially go down as potentially being a defining moment in this season. But he was just excellent all weekend. He was fast throughout practice. He looked the more comfortable McLaren driver, stormed to a comfortable, sort of dominant pole position, and then obviously dominated the race itself. Didn't put a foot wrong, led from start to finish, looked in complete control, and as a result is back in the lead of the World Championship, as we said, for the first time since April. And he's just continued that recent momentum where he's gained on Oscar Piastri for the last 5 race weekends now, and he's had a pace advantage over him. And that this is all since that DNF at Zandvoort, that sort of heartbreaking retirement where we all thought maybe this is, Lando's championship hopes gone up in smoke, and he's really bounced back impressively from that. And just sort of, it was almost like a bit of a reset from his mindset in terms of it, in a way, maybe took the pressure off him a little bit, because he no longer was seen as the championship favourite. Everything seemed to be going Piastri's way at that moment in time. And maybe that helped him relax a little bit and reset and refocus and just be able to ultimately focus on his own performance. And since that moment, he's just been on an absolute roll, and he's got momentum on his side now at a crucial time of the season.
Yeah, I think you've really touched on something there with momentum. I think Lando has played it down a little bit, but he has slightly been renewed since that devastating DNF in Zandvoort, and he has been pulling in the results really consistently. And this was, he did everything he needed to do this weekend to come out on top and reclaim that top spot again. Lucas, this is probably a good opportunity to bring in Oscar Piastri's performance. I think, interestingly enough, he just didn't really look like he was on the pace at all throughout the weekend. Disappointing qualifying for him. I think actually he had a better race on Sunday. He had a mountain to climb to recover any points that he did. He still managed to walk away from the Grand Prix with 10 points, which was still a net positive for Piastri, but he was understandably disappointed with the result over the weekend. He hasn't really been there the last few races, and if you remember, Lucas, this time last year, Oscar began to struggle towards the end of the season as well. And is this potentially coming undone for him? I know this is us saying that, Lando's championship was coming undone, and now we're saying is Oscar's championship coming undone. But it does feel a little bit end of 2024-esque here, doesn't it?
Yeah, a little bit, but again, it's important to note that they are still only separated by 1 point. And I was watching it watching the race with a friend, and I said, I don't really care who finishes where. I just want there to be championship contention at the end of it. That's exactly what we got, so I'm not going to complain. But you are right in that the delta between Lando and Oscar was really, really stark throughout this weekend. I mean, coming into Q3, we had Lando clear the front of the grid by, I think it was 4/10 at the start of the second number of runs. And then Oscar was almost there, and then one by one, drivers overtook him, and he got pushed down and down and down and further down the grid, which was a real shame to see. And there wasn't really anything he could do to stop that after making that attempt. It's just that he couldn't pull it out the bag. And then going into the race, it was a similar story. He did have a bit of an uphill struggle on his hands, and he made good work of it. He was being held back viciously by Yuki Tsunoda in the early parts of the race, who I'm sure had calls from the pit wall telling him, if you let that car past, I swear to God, you're never racing in Formula One again. He did an outstanding job of doing a great Fernando Alonso and turning that Red Bull into a double-decker bus. I held him back for a little while. And then it was onto the Mercedes. And even still, Oscar was having great trouble getting past what was initially George Russell, then Andrea Kimi Antonelli. But the Mercedes radios were funny enough in and of themselves, to be quite frank. But still, he eventually got there, and it was just a matter of chasing down Ollie Bearman towards the end, who, thankfully for us, managed to be saved by a VSC at the penultimate lap, which gave us half a lap of racing towards the end. But by that point, it was all over. So to finish where he did was still a good run, but everybody was fighting to keep him as far down the grid as possible. So he did a good job, all things considered. But Lando, again, was just absolutely miles away. I mean, to have gained, 2 seconds by the end of the first lap or something silly like that. By the end of the race, it was near as 40 seconds. I think it was 36 or thereabouts. But a complete and utterly dominant race for Lando. Absolutely disappeared. He, as you said, he seems to have hit a bit of a stride. He's got momentum on his side. And as we've always said about Lando, when it's good, it's great. But as long as he manages to keep his momentum, there's no limit to how successful this season could be for him.
Yeah,
but I don't think Oscar's going to give it to him easily.
Yeah, definitely. Lewis, just in on this, Lewis, I want to get your opinion on, does this kind of help McLaren? We were quite critical of what situation they were in last week. Where does this then put them now? I mean, they've played this quite well at this point. They've just let them race, and now we're seeing a dominant driver come out, and he's now taking the lead in the championship. Overall, what did you think of how Oscar got on this weekend, and where does this kind of leave McLaren from here? Does this kind of solve the problem for them a little bit?
I'm not sure it does. I think they still have a problem here. It's not an easy one to solve. But I think fundamentally, in terms of Oscar's weekend, it was a positive ending, at least with the Grand Prix. That was the most positive aspect of the weekend. I think it was ultimately damage limitation, and I think a pretty strong fight back, considering we know Mexico's hard to overtake, and he was in that kind of that pack at the start where there's always a chance of getting caught up in a collision, or he managed to stay clean, managed to come through and bank some fairly solid points. Obviously, overall, a disappointing weekend, and I think quite a worrying weekend, just on the recent trend of form that we've seen from Oscar Piastri, that kind of stuttering form that's just continuing. He's not made any kind of big mistakes or errors or anything particularly recently, certainly since Baku, which was obviously an out of character weekend for him, but the pace just hasn't been there. He's just consistently been lagging behind Lando, and arguably in Mexico it was the biggest gap we'd seen and the most sort of concerning gap. And I think the most worrying aspect for Piastri is that he doesn't seem to have an answer for it. After qualifying, he called it a mystery as to why the gap was so big to Norris. And he did say after the race that he'd been driving in a manner that he hadn't found natural. And there's been no changes to McLaren's car. They've not been bringing upgrades or updates like we've seen with Red Bull, bringing little bits here and there. It's stayed the same, but clearly something for Oscar is not working at the moment. He doesn't seem in the happy place with the car. He's lost confidence and as a result lost momentum. I do think there's an element of the title pressure playing a role there. Certainly in maybe Azerbaijan, you could point to that. The last, and maybe Austin as well, with the kind of turn one incident in the sprint race where he crashed into Lando, even though he did get a bit of help from Nico Hulkenberg on the way. I still think the mindset there, the focus was just having to get past Lando. Clearly, needing to be ahead of Lando is playing on his mind at the moment. But in Mexico, that wasn't a factor for him because he was just too far behind. But yeah, he's just lost momentum, and at the most crucial time, at the worst possible time, and he needs to somehow stop the rot. And at the moment, it doesn't seem like there's a clear answer as to how he can do that, because Lando just seems to have a pace advantage at the moment. And before races to go, he's not running out of time, but it needs to. We keep sort of going in the last couple of weekends. We've sort of said, Piastri needs to bounce back here, and he hasn't yet, and he needs to do that sooner rather than later. There's still only a point in it, and I still think it's wide open, and we've seen as well how fast things can change. Only a few weeks ago, we're saying that Lando's out of the championship contention. Now, possibly he's the favourite. Last weekend, I was saying Max is potentially the favourite, and he's still in with a shot and closing the gap, but it keeps swinging, and Piastri is the only consistency in that. And at the moment, he's just continuing to lose out to his two main rivals. In terms of where McLaren go from here, I think at the moment it's kind of handling itself in the sense that they aren't really battling each other right now. Well, certainly they weren't in Mexico, were they? We didn't see them going wheel to wheel. There was no situation where McLaren had to make a call on, holding positions or giving preferential treatment here or there or anything like that. So in some ways it's kind of handling itself at the moment. The interesting thing will be if we get into a situation where Piastri is ahead of Norris, and, whether that's in a race or two's time, if Norris has managed to build a bit of a gap and then they start racing each other, how do they then manage that? Is that the point that maybe there's some kind of interference there to kind of, hold position or favour the driver who's leading, who obviously at the moment that would be Lando. But then that also depends on Verstappen and where he is. And yes, he gained again on the two McLaren drivers this weekend, but he obviously didn't win. He didn't take a big chunk out of their lead. So whatever, there's a bit of a buffer to Max, and if the two McLaren drivers are ahead of him, or at least one of them is, then I suppose McLaren don't really need to make any kind of decision as such to back one or the other, because it kind of will just sort itself out. But we'll see. I still think there could be some, potentially awkward moments down the road if McLaren do fundamentally get back to kind of the form we'd seen previously earlier in the season that seemed to have been lost. And then this weekend, Lando Norris smashes out of the park and absolutely dominates and wins by 30 seconds. And if they can continue that kind of form, then maybe we get back into the sort of topic of how to McLaren handle the dynamic between the two drivers.
Yeah, definitely. It feels like they've dodged the kind of scrutiny this weekend.
A little bit, yeah.
I think you're right, Lewis, because there was never really going to be an opportunity for those two drivers to come wheel to wheel throughout this weekend. Oscar was so far away from Lando, and I think that gulf is really alarming. The fact that not only did Lando win the race, but won it by 30 seconds. So that car is still an incredible race car when they get it right, when they get the setup right over the weekend. We also need to remember Lando missed out on a practice session this weekend. Of course, Pato O'Ward had sat in for FP1, so he was actually a session down, had less time in the car than Oscar, but as soon as he sat in FP2, he just looked the more comfortable driver. So I think potentially there's a mentality thing there, Lewis, but also ultimately something is not clicking for Oscar now, and he really needs to make it up. I think Brazil will be a really good opportunity for that. There's a sprint race in there, so there's more points on the table as well. But Lando does seem more comfortable. He does seem more confident, and when you have that momentum, it is very difficult to kind of derail that sometimes when you get into that kind of into those winning ways. Now, look, ultimately Lando's played that down as well. He said, I've had one good weekend. I haven't had loads of good weekends back to back. I mean, you could argue he has had solid weekends back to back though, especially compared to Oscar, who's pretty much been on a downward trajectory over the last few races as well. So I think that ultimately Lando still has a lot of work to do to kind of build that comfortable lead out. But interestingly enough, I think Oscar could still come back with a strong weekend in Brazil. Right now, though, it's the mystifying element of it that I think will play on his mind and will play on the team's mind as well. Quickly jumping to the Ferraris, I think. I mean, what a weekend for them in some ways, and what a disastrous weekend for them in some ways, Lucas. I mean, the pace was there. They had a really, really good qualifying session. Charles second, Lewis third. I mean, the team were absolutely over the moon on Saturday afternoon. They were absolutely delighted to be back up in the hunt and talking about, fighting for a race win and at least securing a couple of podiums. Lewis Hamilton in particular was saying, like, I'm going to be super aggressive heading into turn one. And then ultimately, it was a disaster. It was a chaotic first lap, of course. Ultimately, there was a lot of cars involved, a lot of scuffles. A lot of cars went off track. Max and Charles both went off track into turn one as well. There was a lot of moments like that. And then Lewis ultimately was hit with a 10-second penalty for, one, leaving the track and gaining an advantage. But also, I think the fact that, there was no kind of communication that he had gained that advantage and that there was a penalty coming in. Just overall, Lucas, before we get into Lewis's penalty, so to speak, I mean, what did you think of the Ferrari performance heading into Saturday, at least, and the qualifying performance from the two drivers?
Yeah, Saturday was pretty incredible. I do not necessarily think that Mexico is entirely representative of where cars or drivers are, because there were a lot of drivers out of place, as we said before. But I think Lewis said this was the first time he'd actually felt properly comfortable in that car and confident behind the wheel, which is great to see, and to be honest, a bit of a relief because we missed him. So it's nice to have him back at least a little bit. Qualifying was very strong for both, as you said, P2, P3. Max didn't seem to be able to offset them at all, nor did Oscar, mind you. But yeah, going into that turn one kerfuffle, I mean, Mexico's sort of notorious for it. It's a really long straightaway after that launch at the start line, going into what is quite a tight 1-2-3 complex, and going almost, well, pretty much four abreast into turn one. It was Lando, Lewis, Charles, and then Max, who was really taking the mickey on the outside there, but I think that's for a later conversation. But yeah, no, it was really tricky. Lando somehow managed to escape from it unscathed, as did Lewis, pretty much. But both Charles and Max getting sent off onto the runoff, which I'm sure will come up again when we do discuss Lewis's penalty. But yeah, Charles coming back on really unexpectedly to me. I don't know about you guys watching the race live, but that one camera angle coming out of turn 4 and Charles all of a sudden just comes right in at the front. And we'll go, oh, hello, where do you come from? But that was all sort of explained when we saw other angles and replays. But Charles pretty much immediately gave the places back that he needed to. We had George on the horn almost immediately complaining about both Charles and Max having gained an advantage off track, which is arguable to a certain extent. But Lewis again off in turn 4, failing to take I think part of it was probably failing to take that runoff, that proper escape road, and taking the Richard Burns route instead, which has its advantages and disadvantages, says his flaw. But yeah, no, just a really strong Saturday for Ferrari. It just all seemed to come apart just a little bit in the race, especially for Lewis, who, despite having that penalty, did make quite a decent comeback, especially considering it was 10 seconds stationary in the pits. Had a decent, solid recovery drive from that. But yeah, plenty to unpack from Ferrari this weekend.
Yeah, I think ultimately, Lucas, you've touched on the point that there was pace there in both of those cars and actually some decent performances from the two drivers. But Lewis, can you get into Hamilton's penalty a little bit and maybe break down exactly what happened with his penalty? I mean, a lot of questions are going around at the moment that why was Lewis singled out, so to speak, as he put it? But maybe you just break down as to what actually the FIA deemed was the issue and why he was handed the 10-second penalty.
Yeah, so the penalty was more for the manner in which he came back onto the track and then didn't give up either time or a position back. So they actually let the fact that he didn't quite follow the escape road, the intention was that he went off as if he was aiming to go down the escape road, but then obviously kind of missed the escape road and cut across the grass. That bit actually wasn't what the stewards penalised him for. It was more coming back onto the track, and that he then sort of showed no attempt at slowing down. And it was complicated by the fact that obviously he should have given the position back to Max, but then Max was having a battle with Ollie Bearman behind and was kind of being held up there. So it would have been quite difficult for Lewis to have given that place back. But fundamentally, he didn't slow down sufficiently. He didn't kind of give back the gain that he'd claimed from cutting the corner. I do think so. I can see why the penalty was applied. I think 10 seconds was quite harsh. I can't remember the last time a driver got a 10-second time penalty for leaving the track and gaining an advantage. I think a 5-second penalty tends to be the norm there. So I'm not quite sure why it was a 10-second time penalty. And I think, I'm not sure why he was the only driver to get a penalty. I think he's, probably right to feel a bit hard done by there. In Max's case, I think he was okay at the sort of turn one start situation. He obviously cuts turn one, turn two, and sort of rejoins at turn three. But he did give the position back to Hamilton that he'd gained. I know George was sort of ranting about it on the radio and felt that he'd gained his unfair advantage. I mean, he did, but at the point going to turn one, he wasn't ahead of George. He cuts the corner, he comes back on, and the position he's gained is against Lewis, and he does concede that, albeit only just. He does let Lewis back ahead, and then they continue their fight, which ultimately results in the clash we see at turn one, and then the subsequent incident with Lewis cutting the corner at turn four. Turn one starts, usually there's a bit more leniency applied as well. The turn one clash with Hamilton as well. A few laps later, when on the same lap that led to the turn four incident, I think that was a bit more interesting because the stewards actually deemed that Hamilton should have given Max more space, but they took no action there because there was no lasting consequence for either driver. I personally, it was quite a late lunge from Max, and obviously contact was made and Lewis was forced a bit wide, so a bit surprised there. He was, I think on the replays, he was ahead at the apex in Verstappen's defence, but yeah, it's one of those, again, that you can argue for and against, but the stewards ultimately determined that no action was required there because they both sort of stayed on track, kind of settled, and then it was at turn four later down the line when the sort of more, the bigger incident, more controversial incident happened. I think the one who's perhaps lucky to get away with it is actually Charles Leclerc, because he, like Max, straight lined the first sequence of corners, and I think he obviously gave the lead back to Lando, having popped out in front, and we were thinking, how's that happened? He's just reinvented the racetrack and emerged in the lead. He obviously gives up the place to Lando, but he really should have given up the place to Hamilton as well, because actually going into turn one, Hamilton was ahead and was also in control of his car at that point. Leclerc wasn't. Now, I don't think there was any intention in it when you see the onboard. Leclerc has a snap going into turn one, loses control and sort of slides out. But at that point, he has a decision to make, and he could continue on. He could get back onto the track and therefore lose a position or two potentially in that moment, or he cuts the corner and he takes the cutting the corner route, comes back on the track, and arguably should have given that place back to Hamilton. And this all kind of results in Hamilton being put in the situation where he kind of shouldn't have been in that position, because he rightly probably should have been second place at that point, not third, and then it ends up resulting in the duel with Verstappen that leads to his penalty. So I think there's quite I think he has reason to feel hard done by there, and I think Leclerc was probably lucky to escape the same penalty as Hamilton. Ferrari were never going to argue that case because it's both their cars, and clearly, while they probably did think, well, Charles probably should have given the place back to Lewis there, they don't want to make that obvious. They don't want to bring that to the steward's attention, because Leclerc could have ended up getting a penalty too, and they both might have dropped off the podium. So Ferrari, if it was different teams, rival teams, I'm sure both would have been complaining and arguing the case for and against. So that was a tricky one, but yeah, I think there's a little bit of a lack of consistency there. But again, it's that difficulty of turn one at the start. There's often more leniency applied to the racing incidents there, but but clearly drivers have just taken advantage of that kind of grey area and that ability. And we saw the same, I think it was last year at Turn 1, Carlos Sainz cut the corner as well and went on to win the race. I think he did give the position back to Max, but yeah, it's a tricky one. I do think there's a little bit of inconsistency there, but I think the biggest thing is just that the 10-second time penalty for Hamilton seemed quite harsh. I'm not quite sure why it was 10 seconds and not a 5-second penalty. But fundamentally, the pace was encouraging, and I think Fred Vasseur afterwards was saying that they thought they would have been on for at least a P4 with Hamilton, based on his pace. Even if he potentially only had a 5-second time penalty, he could have still been on for fourth place and potentially that first podium. I'm not sure that would have necessarily happened with the pace of Max at the end of the race. But yeah, Ferrari felt a bit aggrieved as well. I think Vasseur sort of highlighted a few inconsistencies there, and equally unhappy that Hamilton ends up getting such a big penalty. And yeah, it seems from the outside that he's been singled out because he's the only one who's come away with a penalty, and there are several drivers going off and doing similar things.
Yeah, well, this is it. I mean, I guess you've touched on it there, Lewis, with consistency. Lucas, we've been critical of some of the stewarding decisions over the course of this season, and it's happened in seasons past and things like that as well. I mean, I saw you were kind of rolling your eyes a little bit at the prospect of Max not getting a penalty. I mean, that late lunge, I think everyone has a bit of an opinion on that as well. Ultimately, Lewis, he was ahead at the apex, but I think also the issue with it being written into the rules is, are you in control of your car still? And whether Max was still in control at that point is kind of a difficult one to say as well. I mean, Lucas, do you think that this was a penalty for Hamilton? I mean, I think most people would agree it is a penalty of some sort, but 10 seconds again, quite harsh. And then, what do you think about Max kind of escaping any sort of retribution or anything like that from his move?
Yeah, again, I agree, 10 seconds is harsh. Who knows, maybe they took the penalty that they thought Charles could have got and just put it both onto Lewis, so that 2 5-second penalties ends up as 110, maybe. But, I mean, say what you will about the Lewis and Max incident at T1, but it really was nice to see a little bit of vintage Max versus Lewis action for what it's worth, even if it was...
There's always drama when they come together, isn't there?
Oh, 100%. I mean, Cops is ringing in my head. But yeah, no, it's great to see a little bit of action, and it was definitely vintage Max as well. Just sod it, just stick it down the inside, hope for the best, sees what happens. And yeah, maybe he was ahead at the apex, but there is no argument to be said that he was in control of his car, unless he was intending on pushing Lewis wide there. I think it's as simple as that, open and shut. I mean, we see from the slow motion angle from T3 looking at T1 that, he was just sort of understeering out wide, which is what it is, I suppose. A little bit of touching here and there, and then to come back and around, and it did feel a little bit silly, but if we keep nailing down on penalizing drivers for risky or potentially dangerous moves, then it becomes difficult to draw the line. And if we're giving penalties to everybody, then we don't see this kind of action, and we don't have these conversations. So it's a tough act to balance, really, isn't it? I mean, we could compare that to, I think it was it Gabriel Bortoletto's move, wherein he did that really late braking weave and then all of a sudden just stuck it around the outside and held on for dear life, and it worked. Why couldn't have Max done something similar like that? That was a phenomenal move, and there was no contact. Both drivers escaped unscathed, and the position was gained, and no real controversy was resulted from it. So, yeah, a little bit disappointing, but again, it was still a move, and I'm glad it happened, regardless of how relatively legal or illegal it may or may not have been.
Well, let's get on to Max's performance overall this weekend. I think there was a lot of hype heading into the Mexican Grand Prix that this could be a serious title charge for Max if he had another weekend like he did the previous weekend in Austin. It became pretty evident from qualifying that that wasn't going to be the case. Red Bull had brought a number of upgrades, Lewis, this time, and it really felt like they were taking the drivers' fight very seriously and they're trying to give Max everything he wants. But disappointing qualifying result for him. He really played down the idea of making up any kind of places, but ultimately, he still ended up on the podium. I think it's still a good result for Max overall.
Yeah, massively. I think he will come away from this weekend pretty happy because fundamentally he leaves Mexico in a better position than he was going into it. He's closer to both McLaren drivers than he was. He's now 36 points behind Lando Norris in the championship, so he has gained. Okay, it's only a 4-point swing in his favour over the weekend, not quite the dramatic swing we've seen in previous races, and yeah, he's not kind of continued that momentum from that win in Austin. But I think from where he was, it was a difficult Friday and Saturday for Red Bull. They had the one lap pace, it seemed, on Friday, but Max was already raising concerns about the race pace, and he just thought that Red Bull were going to have no chance to fight for victory. But he was well off the pace in qualifying in terms of not being in contention to fight for pole position, which was maybe a little bit of a surprise with the pace he showed on Friday. But I think to gain places and to make it up onto the podium fundamentally is a great result. And again, Red Bull using that sort of offset strategy, doing something a little bit different, worked in their favour, being aggressive, as we keep seeing from Red Bull, and it pays off. And Verstappen drove a superb race in the end. I mean, that final stint on soft tyres was incredible, and just charging down, catching Charles Leclerc. Yeah, he'll be. I think he kind of downplayed it afterwards. He said, he wasn't too frustrated that he missed out with the timing of the virtual safety car. It's one of those things. It swings one way and goes the other way. And another weekend, sometimes you win and sometimes you lose from it. But I think fundamentally he'll be pretty delighted with that result. He's outperformed one McLaren, and he's not. He's still gained on the other, and ultimately closed the gap in the championship. I think he's doing all he can do at the moment. He's getting the most out of the Red Bull every opportunity, every weekend, and that's kind of all he can do. I did sort of say, maybe he's the favourite, after last weekend, from maybe getting a bit caught up in the moment of that in that time, but I still wouldn't put it past him. I don't think you can ever rule him out. We're coming up to some circuits that are great for him. Brazil, we saw that incredible drive last year. Obviously, it was in the rain, but whether it's wet or dry, I expect he and Red Bull will be up there. Brazil's another race where there's always drama. There's always some kind of incident. It's a tricky turn 1, turn 2, turn 3. There's always the kind of risk for some jeopardy and rain, weather thrown into the mix. It's unpredictable there. And if it rains, then I would put all my money on Max Verstappen winning in Brazil. I think, but either way, he should have a good car there. I think for Verstappen in terms of the championship, he clearly needs to be ahead of both McLarens. Ideally, he needs to be winning pretty much every race to really have a chance, and he probably also needs a bit of luck, or bad luck to hit the McLaren drivers too. But I think fundamentally the next 2 Grand Prix will be crucial for his championship, whether he can cling on and take it to the final rounds or not. Because if you look at sort of the tracks that we've got coming up, perhaps Interlagos may suit Red Bull more, or as I said, I'd expect Verstappen to be up there in Brazil. Vegas, Verstappen's gone well there in the past. It's a bit of a potential bogey track for McLaren. And then the final 2 races, Qatar and Abu Dhabi, probably play back into McLaren's favour and strengths. So I think the next 2 will be the biggest opportunities maybe for Verstappen to take those kind of big points chunks out of the McLaren drivers that he ultimately needs to do if he's going to be really in this fight. I mean, he's doing everything he can to sort of just hang in there and keep it a 3-way fight. But if McLaren can continue their momentum from this weekend and take that kind of performance into Brazil, then it'll be pretty hard to overturn that. But I think, again, Verstappen just maximising everything from the weekend and coming away with a great result that just keeps him in the fight.
Yeah, definitely. I think the main issue as well is potentially just some inconsistency with that Red Bull car. it does feel like Max is definitely maximizing the package every weekend where he can, but it is just track to track quite difficult for them to predict how the performance is going to be come the Saturday and then the Sunday. I think ultimately we've seen their Sundays have been pretty strong as well, and I think the qualifying results are what catch you out, and even the fact that Max he was pretty despondent heading into the weekend. He basically said, I'm going to need a couple of retirements ahead of me as well, but he made up the positions, he stood on the podium, and the gap is still coming down. And Lewis, I think you're right, we were getting caught up in Max is the favourite, but these next two races, all it takes is just for him to be on that run of form that he has been in the past, and things will really be flipped on their head. Lucas, I wanted to ask about the timing of the VSC. Obviously, we were kind of in for a really exciting end to the race with Max absolutely chasing Charles down. Obviously, VSC came out due to Carlos Sainz's DNF. He had an engine problem, and then I think it was a little bit of a weird decision considering where Carlos ultimately had pulled the car in. There was double yellows for some time. He had managed to get the car into what I would say was a relatively safe position for a bit of racing. Obviously, the back of the car was still kind of sticking out when there was marshals on track at that point. But, what do you think about the decision to actually deploy the VSC? Do you think it was maybe a little bit premature?
Yeah, it was a little bit premature. I, for one, am always an advocate of erring on the side of safety. We've seen it time and time again where we've gone perhaps a little bit too lax on safety. In some cases, the worst has happened, and in others, it's just turned out quite badly. So, I'm never going to be mad at a race director for doing that. Do I think it was 100% necessary for this? No. As Carlos had put the car in a relatively safe position, it would have been quick and easy to recover. It was already partially behind barriers, and to just pull it in the rest of the way would have been really easy. And it was really easy because, as we saw, the VSC lasted a lap and a half tops. So yeah, it was a shame that we lost out on that last couple laps battles, both between Bearman and Piastri and Max and Charles. What did annoy me just a little bit was that I think the gap to Charles was still 1.2 to 1.4 seconds. Meanwhile, Oscar was already pretty much inside Ollie Bearman, and yet we were still focusing on Max. But that's TV director problems, and that's been a problem for a long time now. But even still, those battles still were very close. And had the VSC ended perhaps a little bit earlier, if we'd been given an entire lap under clean racing as opposed to just half, we may have seen a little bit more of an upset towards the front of the grid. But yeah, no, I really can't take away from the fact that safety here is really important. Whether it was a little bit too safe, perhaps. We had both Karun Chandok and David Croft on in the commentators booth just asking what's going on. Why have we got this VSC for so long? Which I do understand the frustration, both from a viewer's perspective, a commentator's perspective, and a team's perspective. But end of the day, needs must for these things, right? And as long as we who are we to complain, man? We got a really, really good race. If we lost a penultimate lap of racing, then that's fine. The rest of it was phenomenal, and I can't really complain.
I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's just the frustration of that feeling of being robbed of that great finish, because it was really building up to an exciting end. And yeah, I think Max possibly would have got, Charles, he had the pace to do so, and it was just the fact that we missed out on that battle, and that would have been great. And again, yeah, as you touched on, Lucas, Piastri was all over the back of Bearman, and had he got that place, he actually would have retained the championship lead. And we'd still be saying momentum's with Norris, but it suddenly looked a little bit different, doesn't it? But I think, yeah, fundamentally, safety is the first and foremost importance there, and that was the reason for the call to bring out the virtual safety car when they did. I think the important thing was that the FIA actually noted afterwards that the car was in an exposed position. Perhaps like TV footage didn't necessarily show that properly. I think they sent some images through and kind of highlighted that actually the rear end of the car was still exposed. And okay, it's the slowest part of the track. It's it's not the most dangerous position, but Carlos Sainz spun off there, so only takes another guy to spin off in the exact same place, and you've got a situation you don't want there. The other aspect of it too was that there was smoke coming out of his car, and there was a potential fire risk. So that also played into the decision. There were, the marshals were needed to be there in case there was a fire. And I think that also played into the decision making too, that maybe was overlooked at the time, that there was potentially a fire hazard there and just extra precaution needed to be taken.
Yeah, also, Lewis, potentially what might have played into their decision was that slightly disastrous moment with the Marshals and Liam Lawson earlier on in the race, which we didn't really actually get to see a whole lot of on the broadcast, but it was doing, all the rounds on socials. I mean, what really happened there? I mean, if you see some of the images, it's pretty shocking to see how close Lawson actually came to those two Marshals that came out on track to clear some of that debris.
Yeah, the whole situation is just completely unacceptable. It's obviously not what we want to be seeing at all. It was really scary. And it was fundamentally only sort of thanks to a combination of Liam Lawson's sort of quick reactions to slow down and also the nature of those corners as well, being, slower speed. He's braking into the corner and can see the marshals running across the track. But, it might have been a different story if it was another part of the track, particularly through that high speed section of the circuit where there's a few blind corners. I mean, yeah, it could have been a different story altogether. And I think Lawson was, rightly furious. And it's something that the FIA need to look into. I think they've said that they sort of will conduct a thorough investigation into it to actually determine exactly how that happened and why that happened. Clearly, the marshals were clearing away debris, but there must have been some kind of communication breakdown or something's gone wrong somewhere, because that was far too close for comfort. That needs to be investigated and made sure that it doesn't happen again and we learn from it. But as you said, that may well have also played into the decision making later on in the race, which at the time, when when there was a bit of uproar that the race had ended under virtual safety car conditions pretty much, or at least the fight had been ruined by that. We didn't realise what had gone on earlier in the race. That only kind of came to light afterwards, with the near miss with the marshals. So again, with marshals needing to be around Carlos's car, with potentially there being a fire there, or at least having to put the smoke out, that also would have played a factor, I'm sure, in just taking that extra precaution. And I don't think we can have any complaints about that ultimately.
Yeah, definitely. It feels like when you have these chaotic weekends as well, where there's a lot going on, there's a lot of bases to cover as well. And it is really, really difficult when there's lots of things happening on track and decisions have to be made quickly in the moment. And the FIA and F1 are constantly trying to balance this issue out, where they want to still keep people entertained and still run a very enjoyable race, but also just ultimately keep everyone safe on the track as well. So an interesting development there, and hopefully the FIA gets to the bottom of what happened with the marshals there as well. I just want to touch on really quickly as well, Lewis, Ollie Bearman. I mean, career best finish for him. What a race from the Haas driver. I mean, he's had a bit of an upward trajectory over the last couple of races anyway. Ayo Komatsu, the Haas team boss, has kind of treated him like this kind of young driver with lots of talent, but hasn't been afraid to be critical of him either as well, and has kind of said, look, Ollie's got the raw pace, he's fantastic, but sometimes he just makes decisions in the moment and lets his excitement get to him, and then that can ultimately ruin his race. This weekend will just be complete vindication for Ollie that he feels that, he's pulled in a fantastic result. I mean, one of the best results for that team. And I mean, was it ever really, wasn't a podium ever in contention there at all? Or was that just wishful thinking, but ultimately still a really good performance from him?
Yeah, no, it's an outstanding drive from Ollie Bearman. And yeah, there's a little bit of similarity there with sort of Kimi Antonelli, isn't there, in terms of the sort of bringing in that young raw talent, and there's clearly talent in there. There's clearly pace in there, and he has had a bit of a mixed season. There's been, flashes of speed and that raw talent, but mistakes too, and some questionable decision making at times. But that's part and parcel of being a rookie driver over the course of a season. And the competition's so tight and so fierce that mistakes are going to creep in. But clearly, those highs for Ollie Bearman are particularly high, and we saw that here in Mexico with just an incredible drive, just reward for that performance to finish P4 and earn his best result and Haas's best result in F1. Also Haas, hats off to Haas, they absolutely nailed that strategy. I think the pit stops, two brilliant pit stops for Bearman as well, under high pressure, that kept him in in the battle. You asked whether a podium was ever really on the cards. I think we probably all got a little bit carried away. Yeah, he was running genuinely on pace and looked strong, but I think if we look at how the race panned out and Max's pace at the end, I think, yeah, fundamentally, I don't think a podium was really on the cards. I think fourth place was probably the best result they could have got in reality, because they had two options, and I think they chose the right option in pitting him. They could have sort of left him out in the hope that he would hold on to the tyres and use that sort of the time buffer to keep Verstappen behind. But I think the pace that Verstappen showed in that last stint, ultimately he would have been a bit of a sitting duck and would have lost that place anyway. So I don't think Haas lost anything by bringing him in for a second stop, and taking the sort of more aggressive strategy. If anything, it kind of solidified his position in fourth, because he was able to keep the Mercedes behind on those fresher tyres, and maybe he would have come under a bit of threat from those two had he not made that pit stop and was just sort of hanging on to the tyres at the end. So I think it was a well executed race from both Bearman and Haas, and a fully deserved result, and an impressive result. And I think we've seen that. We've been excited by Bearman from even last year when he first stepped into Ferrari as a last minute substitute and scored points on his debut and finished ahead of Lewis Hamilton. And I think we've always known that he's a special talent. It's just kind of like nurturing that, and a rookie season, there's going to be ups and downs. It's going to be a bit of a roller coaster, but he's kind of in that position where he'll have a bit of time. He's not in a front running team where he's expected to get wins and podiums and potentially fight for championships. And that, I think that's the difference with Kimi Antonelli. He's been thrown in a team that expects a lot more, and the pressure and the scrutiny is so much bigger. Whereas Bearman's got a bit of time, and he's at that place where he can kind of sort of bed into it with a little bit less scrutiny and spotlight on him. But I think fundamentally he's shown his worth again, and fundamentally why he is a Ferrari junior driver, and probably one day will drive for Ferrari in the future.
Yeah, Lucas, you've been a big fan of Bearman throughout this season, and you've noted some of his really good performances. But I mean, what did you think of how he conducted himself throughout qualifying, and then ultimately in the race? How he pulled that result out, and I think being able to hold off Piastri as well with the pace that McLaren had is something that really does need to be marvelled at. And I mean, look, we did say that the virtual safety car did maybe help him out a little bit, but I think he did a really good job of holding off Piastri, up until that point as well.
Yeah, I think it is, as Lewis brought up, I think it is quite important to note the difference between him and Kimi Antonelli. I mean, it's no wonder how much of a difference it makes being put into a team that isn't expected to be performing at the front of the grid week in, week out. He's not had the same amount of pressure, he's not had the same amount of scrutiny, and that's allowed him to keep his head down and occasionally pull out absolute barnstormers like he did yesterday. It's also important to note that both Haas's did, in fact, finish in the points this weekend. It wasn't just Ollie Bearman who put on a great performance, phenomenal as it was. The Haas's were just really strong this weekend in general as well. Going back to Ollie, though, I think it was straight off the line. He gained 3 places before we'd even hit turn 1. He had a really strong launch, and managed to keep himself out of trouble going to that absolutely chaotic turn 1-2, which again requires kudos in and of itself. But yeah, all race long he was putting in great performances. I mean, defending at one point against Max, even though Max was on an ailing car, let's say, with his 3 tyres and a 50 pence piece, he still managed to put on a great defence against him, and was holding P3 on merit for a good while, which I think we all knew it was never really going to shake out to be a podium for Ollie, but the hopes were definitely there. Just really strong performance in general, and there have been glimpses of it throughout the year, although nothing quite to this extent. But it does leave us very hopeful for the future. Whereas going over to Mercedes and looking at Kimi, he's made similarly silly decisions, but again, he's just got a lot more pressure on his back, and I don't know if Ayo Komatsu's prophesizing as a prodigy is quite as overbearing as Toto's might be. It's very interesting to see how it shakes out for both of the rookies, I reckon.
I think the important and positive thing there for Bearman is also that he's kind of turned around that kind of mid-season. He started the season very well, got a few points finishes early on, and then kind of had a bit of a rough patch in the middle part of the season. And he's actually really turned a corner, and that's his third points finish in a row, and I think the fourth in the last 6 races, I believe. So he's really like turned things around and has got that kind of trajectory and positive momentum his way. And as you touched on, also a great result for Haas. And they brought upgrades in Austin, and they clearly have worked well because they're still pushing hard, and that result actually leaves them only 10 points off 6th place in the Constructors' Championship now. So if they can continue that kind of form and get a bit of luck on their side, because the battle, sort of those 6 to 9 teams in the Constructors' Championship, it keeps swinging every weekend, where we see a Sauber getting a great result, or a Haas getting points, and then Racing Bulls in the point. It does keep swinging weekend in, weekend out, but Haas have got some real momentum behind them at the moment, and are executing races really well. And Esteban Ocon also deserves plaudits for finishing 9th, and also the team as a whole executing his race and getting a 2-car points finish. It wasn't that all the focus was on Ollie Bearman and they could only get 1 car in the points. They've still, as a team, got a great result that's brought them potentially in contention to finish as high as 6th this season if they can finish in the points again in those final 4 races.
Yeah, I mean, it's the beauty of Formula One, isn't it? I mean, an operation like Haas with such limited resources can still, put in the work and come away with good results. And, you mentioned Lewis Sauber. We've seen as well that, they've been very chaotic in the last couple of years, even though they are, on the verge of becoming this really big organization next year with Audi. But, I mean, they'd kind of been operating on a similar level, if not worse, to the likes of Haas in the years past. But this year they've been really impressive too. And I think that's something that's going to be really interesting, watching that Constructors' title fight. Just lastly, I mean, I suppose we should really touch on it. I mean, Ferrari have now managed to get back into 2nd position in the Constructors' title. They hold that only by a point to Mercedes now. Lewis, I think that was a really chaotic weekend for Mercedes overall. I think their pace wasn't really there, but obviously the main talking point over the weekend was George Russell's just constant frustration pretty much from lap 1. Obviously, he was unhappy with how a lot of the other drivers handled that turn 1 incident. And then from then on, he was just getting really frustrated. He was quicker than Kimi, and I think that it was a very weird decision for Mercedes not to swap the positions earlier. He really just cooked his tyres in that stint. And I mean, it ultimately kind of, ruined his race. I mean, it was a bit weird for Mercedes, I think. It felt very chaotic.
It was. And I think Russell's frustrations ultimately stemmed down from the start. That put him in an instant bad mood, didn't it? And it just got worse from there. We heard some pretty entertaining sort of radio rants from him in the race. Again, Mercedes just kind of in that bit of no man's land, weren't they, for another sort of weekend where they've just kind of ended up in a bit of a low-key finishing position. And I agree. I think it was strange that they decided to make the call to swap positions when they did, having given away so much time. Why did they not just make that call a little bit earlier on, given George a chance to have a run at the cars ahead and potentially be fighting for the final podium spot, but certainly 4th or 5th place. And as you say, by the end, he's absolutely cooked his tyres in the dirty air behind Kimi Antonelli, and they kind of messed that up a little bit. But still, even sort of that incident aside, it was just not a particularly great weekend for Mercedes. A bit disappointing again. Kind of same old as we touched on before in previous podcasts, that their swings, they're so inconsistent. One weekend they'll be up there seemingly out of nowhere, and then they'll be nowhere. And we do have, it's hard to kind of pinpoint how competitive they'll be at the remaining races, but the one that stands out is obviously Vegas, where George Russell absolutely dominated last season. Cooler conditions usually play to Mercedes' advantage. So that could be sort of maybe Mercedes' potentially last chance of getting another win this season. Brazil as well. Russell's been good there in the past. Obviously got his first Grand Prix win with Mercedes in Brazil a few years ago. But Vegas is the one that really stands out as kind of, there's almost a little bit of expectation that Mercedes will be right up there. So it'll be interesting to see whether they are or whether they're kind of nowhere again. But interesting in the battle for 2nd place in the Constructors' Championship now that they've kind of lost that little bit of momentum that they they gained recently, and Ferrari have now had two strong weekends and seem to, Ferrari haven't been bringing any upgrades to their car, but they seem to be able to extract more from it in terms of the procedures, in terms of how they're setting it up. They just seem to be getting more out of the weekend as a whole, really since sort of Austin. And those weekends in Azerbaijan and Singapore where they started strongly and then it all fell away and they seemed to get slower. They weren't getting the most out of the package. I think that's something that both Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc have sort of referenced, in that obviously they're not as quick as the McLarens, but they're also just haven't been executing their weekends well enough. Whereas maybe we're starting to see that now. I think the last couple of weekends have been very positive for Ferrari, and if they can keep that up over the remaining few races, they'll come out on top in that battle for P2. Certainly, momentum's on their side at the moment compared to Mercedes, and then Red Bull are also right in there, but that is really a sort of a one car situation there, where it's down to Verstappen and what he can do, whether he can pull them up to second place. But that'll be an interesting sort of battle, aside from obviously all the main talk and interest is going to surround the Drivers' Championship, obviously. But that fight for P2 is also hotting up in the Constructors' Championship heading into the final few rounds.
Yeah, absolutely. And really quickly, just before we finish up, Lucas, I wanted to briefly touch on next year. Sergio Perez was back in the paddock this weekend, obviously, for what was traditionally his home Grand Prix. Obviously, he'll be back with Cadillac next year, but he did a very kind of revealing interview with Sky Sports, I felt, and had some very choice words about his experiences in Red Bull. He had basically said no driver can survive in that team, in that position I was. He kind of highlighted that, I'm kind of quite tough mentally and I was able to still stick it out, and these drivers are proving that I was right. And I mean, he did say that without disparaging Yuki Tsunoda and Liam Lawson. He said, look, they're both good drivers. I mean, obviously, we're looking forward to seeing Perez back on the grid next year with Cadillac, but the wider question, I mean, what has this kind of revealed about the dynamic in Red Bull? And we see how good Max is, and obviously Red Bull is under new leadership and things like that, but what do you think this kind of, Perez's revelations kind of say about that wider operation and how they can conduct the end of this season and into next season?
I mean, it's something that we have been suspecting or speculating on for years now. That intra-team dynamic at Red Bull has always been under scrutiny. We've seen driver after driver after driver fall by the wayside as Max has stormed into the distance, and it's been that way for a good number of years. And to have a little bit of a glimpse behind the curtain from a former driver is a rare opportunity, and he's said almost exactly what we were all thinking. As for what that means for next year, I mean, we all saw Yuki's post-race interview, didn't we? I mean, he didn't seem pleased, which, granted, he had really no right to be, but even still, his general demeanor and enthusiasm for the seat in which he is a nigh on nil at this point. And it's all but spoken that he won't be there next year, I think, at this point. As for who will, maybe Isaac Hadjar will get demoted to a Red Bull seat. That would be a thing. But I fear that he might suffer the same fate as every other driver who's been there in the past. And I don't really see what makes him any different, which is not to disparage Isaac Hadjar. I just think that it's when you've tried so many variables and one thing is constant, the conclusion becomes that the constant is the issue, right? And to have Checo come out and pretty much confirm that fact is pretty damning towards the Red Bull dynamic. And yeah, it's tough to see where this is going to go moving forwards unless some really seismic changes are made behind the scenes, none of which we are likely to be privy to. So it very much remains speculation, despite the fact that Checo's come out so explicitly and said what we all expected.
I think the potential saving grace for Hadjar next year, assuming he does get the drivers we all expect, is just the change in regulations, and that it will be a clean sweep and a clean sort of start to his time at Red Bull. And perhaps Red Bull can, iron out the issues, the tricky nature of the car to drive, that might help out Hadjar or whoever is in that seat next season. Maybe, but I still think that the bigger issue is just being teammates with Max Verstappen is the is the is the problem there, isn't it? I think whoever is probably alongside Verstappen's probably going to get blown away by him. It's just the question of how much by. But I think Checo he's probably feeling quite smug at the moment. Just having sort of his reputation and stock took such a hit at the end of last season, and actually looking back on it, he hadn't done a bad job really. When we look at how things went for Liam Lawson and even Yuki Tsunoda now, he did things were going better for Checo than both of those, and now he can come back to the grid next year in that kind of perfect scenario for Checo in a way, like I was going to say a midfield team. We're probably expecting Cadillac to be at the back next year to start with at least, but coming back at a team with low expectations where he can just shine and pull out those kind of performances that we saw when he was at Force India, Racing Point, Sauber. I think it will take a lot of weight off him and a lot of relief for Checo just to kind of see that it wasn't just all him. But yeah, on the driver point, just interesting as well that Red Bull have announced that they're postponing the decision until after Abu Dhabi. The reason they've given for that is just purely that they're going to focus on the Drivers' Championship and want all of the focus to be on trying to get Max Verstappen that 5th straight world title and not be distracting about talking about who may be in the seat alongside him next season, which I think also be, go down well for Isaac Hadjar, because ahead of this weekend he was saying that all the speculation, all the talk, all the repeated questions every weekend is, does he know where he's going to be next season? Starting to annoy him a little bit. So I think it's probably best for all parties that everyone can just sort of focus on the last 4 races and the important stuff. And I think we all expect Yuki Tsunoda to be out and Isaac Hadjar to be in, but it doesn't really help anyone to keep talking about that every weekend. So yeah, Red Bull have kind of tried to shut that down now, stop all the rumours, all the talk, and we'll see what their decision is at the end of the year, even though I think we all know what it probably will be.
Yeah. As always in Formula One, anything can happen from week to week. Well, that's all we've got time for this week. Thank you very much for listening. As always, no race next week, but of course we'll be back with a sprint race in Brazil in 2 weeks' time. Lots of action. So in the meantime, make sure you check out the Crash.net website for all the latest Formula One news and analysis. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. And until then, thanks for listening.